Okay, I know I didn't mention this in the first segment, but I guess I'll just address the elephant in the room. No, not you, gratitude. I know. I'm sorry, but it's not always about you. Just the Donald Trump thing that happened on Thursday. He was convicted of 34 counts. But I'm not going to have a tirade or anything like that. And I'm not going to mention anything about it because I didn't open the show with it. It has nothing really to do with, I mean, it does because in this segment on blame, I'm going to mention certain things that have to do with politics and sports that get into blame, but it's nothing specific towards him or anything. So I wasn't even going to mention it, but it's a big news story that happened this week. And since the show is coming out right after that, I thought I would mention it because people are going to be like, well, what's your take on it? And honestly, I don't have a take. It doesn't, to me, it really doesn't matter because it was just, I didn't expect it to happen. I thought he was going to get off because he gets off on everything. But I also don't expect him to go to jail. I just don't because he just gets off on everything. He gets away with everything. So why wouldn't he get away with this? I may later on have a show on both of them, him and Biden, that that toes the line around the Goldwater rule, but that is a show for a later time. But it's not now.
And that's all I had to say about that.
Okay, so let's get into blame. The psychology of blame. What is going on right now is the playoffs, the NBA and the NHL playoffs. The Panthers are going on another run. And it's the NHL playoffs are the one thing that makes me the most anxious, especially when it comes to the Panthers. But what's happening with specifically the Panthers is everyone's complaining about the refs. The Bruins fans went nuts over the referees, and even the Tampa fans when the Panthers played Tampa, and even in the Western Conference, people are complaining about refs and penalties and everything. And this is a pervasive thing that happens in sports. The losing team always complains that they got the short end of the stick, and they blame officials. This happens in politics too. People blame the other side. They blame other people for their problems. And I thought this was a good topic to do, to find out what is the psychology of why people do these things. Why do they blame officials for their team's failures? Because losers always tend to blame the officials. They never blame their team for playing poorly. They always say, well, that's a bad call, and that's the reason that they lost. But, the Panthers, they didn't score that many. For Tampa, the Tampa series, Tampa complained the entire series about the officials. The fans did. And they had more power plays. The Bruins complained about the officials the entire series, but the Panthers didn't score that many power play goals. Marchand missed 2 games, but the Panthers won only one of those games. Okay. And he came back for game 6, and the Bruins lost that game. So what's the complaint here? Is it the officials or just the Bruins weren't good enough? Right? But they still blame the officials, right? They didn't blame the fact that the Bruins just weren't good enough, right? Swayman was crazy good. The rest of the team wasn't good enough, right? But it's the officials' fault, right? And it's same in this New York series against the Rangers. They're blaming the refs, but the Rangers are playing really well. They're just not playing well enough. And the reason the Rangers are in this series is because their goalie is crazy good. Igor Shesterkin is playing out of his mind. If it was any other goalie, this would be a sweep. The Panthers would have swept them. This series would be already over. The Panthers would already be in the Stanley Cup Finals. Okay, but because of the goalie, not because of the refs. But this is what happened. So this is how I want to get into this one article on the theory of blame. It's from 2014. And I tried to get the authors to come on and explain this to me because it's extremely complicated. But neither of them could make it. So I'm going to do my best to do it. And I'm not a psychologist. And again, I tried to make sense of this for myself. And I don't know how much sense I could make of it, but I'm going to do my best. And again, it's a very complicated article. So I'm just going to point out the things that I thought were really interesting and that made sense for the topic of the things that are happening in the world, refs, politics. And I'm not going to get into this entire 40-page article, the minutia, because the details are really, in the weeds. But what I will do is I will link the article in the podcast description, so that you guys can read it for yourself. There's actually 2 articles that I'm going to try and get to. The first one's the longer one. The second one, I just want to kind of hit 1 or 2 points on it, if I have the time to do it. Anyway, so here's the thing. So they created this model of blame called the path model. And it's how people go from detecting what they call a norm violation, which is the detection of a thing to blame, all the way through how they blame people. And the way this model goes is someone detects this norm violation, something happens, and they see something to blame. Then they go to agent causality. In other words, is there someone to blame? Yes or no? If there's no one to blame, there's no blame. Okay? And on YouTube, I will add this little kind of graph that they have here. Okay? Is there someone to blame? If there's no one to blame, no blame. If there is someone to blame, then they go to intentionality. Was it intentional? If no, then was there an obligation for this person? Did this person have, or this thing have an obligation? If no, then there's little or no blame. If there was an obligation, then this person, did they have the capacity to understand that they had an obligation? If no, then again, low to no blame. If yes, then there's blame and what degree to blame. Now, going back to intentionality, right? If there was intentionality, then what is the reason for the blame, for the action? Okay? And after that, then there's blame. All right, so that's the path model. All right? All right. Now, there's a lot of details in this, right? At each little box of this, from the event detection to the agent causality to intentionality, obligation, capacity, reasons, there's all kinds of details in those things. And it's way, way, way too much to get into. So I'm not going to get into each one of those details because this podcast would take 2 hours. And it's not that interesting for what we're trying to talk about, which is refs and politics. But what I do want to get into is a couple of things that I thought were interesting related to this. So one of the things was something called parsimony. The definition of parsimony is, in general, the unwillingness to use resources to make decisions. In other words, shortcuts. And people do this all the time, is they use shortcuts to make decisions. Specifically, one of them is event-implied information. So, in other words, let's say a husband forgets a wife's birthday, right? Do you blame the husband for that? Well, the assumption is that it was unintentional, right? All right, so there's a norm violation there, right? The husband forgot the birthday, right? And there's an agent, right? The husband, right? But was it intentional? The assumption is no. Why would a husband forget their wife's birthday? So there's an invent implied information there, right? And that's a shortcut people use to get to the blame. Okay. In other words, another one is like a dog bites a kid, right? There's a norm violation. There's an agent. It's the dog, but you assume that the dog wouldn't do that. Now, a lot of people assume that the dog would do it intentionally because of the type of dog, right? Certain dogs, they assume, do that intentionally. So there's a lot of pre-assumptions in this event implied information kind of thing, right? And that brings me to the second part of this parsimony thing, all right? And there's a couple of other ones in this parsimony, but the two that I wanted to key on is the preset values one, okay? And this is where we get into the politics and the sports part, is that people use shortcuts, and I know I'm pointing at you with a pencil because this is my fidgeting thing that I do. You can see it on YouTube, but the people that are listening can't see this, but I'm pointing at you with a pencil, right? The preset values part, okay? People use narratives to make these kinds of value judgments, okay? And the narratives are created by people that give them to you, okay? In other words, if you always think that a person is reckless, you know, Joni's reckless, then if something happens, then you just attributed that to her recklessness that you've always thought that she had without actually taking into account the specific situation that might have happened. In other words, Joni's reckless. Oh, she got into a car accident. She must have been driving fast, right? Without actually knowing, without actually hearing the story. Maybe she got rear-ended. This particular time she got rear-ended, right? You didn't hear the story. Oh, she's reckless. She just got into an accident because she was speeding, right? And this happens, okay, with sports and politics a lot, okay? Because what happens is politicians give you narratives, okay? They say, the caravan from Mexico is coming, right? And they're full of criminals. So you hear immigrants are coming over. Oh, it must be from the caravan. They're all criminals, right? You don't hear anything about what the actual story is, about immigrants or people trying to get here as refugees from war-torn places. All immigrants must be criminals because you're the narrative you're given. Okay, it's the same with minorities of any kind. Minorities are bad people because that's the narrative you're given. Okay, again, I did this. Was it last week? No, it was the week before that when we did extreme overvalued beliefs. This happened in the Holocaust, right? Jews are bad people. They're stealing your money, right? You don't want to hear anything about any stories related to them because that's the narrative you're given. Happens in sports too, right? The refs are out to get us because the game is rigged because they want the Panthers to win, which is a completely ridiculous thing. Because why would the NHL want a small market like South Florida, like Sunrise, over the freaking New York market or the Boston market? Like, it's completely ridiculous. But that's the narrative for these teams, right? To blame the officials, right? So the narrative is it's rigged against us. And so every time there's a penalty against your team, it's, oh, I'm not even looking at the replay to see if it was legitimate. It's automatically rigged. And that's the shortcut to the blame. Okay? So that's the preset values part of the parsimony that's in this blame model. Okay? And I'm going to get into why it's so emotional later on as part of this article. All right. There's another thing in here about a research that was done by Cushman in 2008, where he came up with something that he called the model of wrongness and blame. And He said that people's judgment about wrongness of an agent's behavior are driven by assessments of the agent's mental states. This is his theory on blame. All right. And namely, the agent's beliefs and desires. And this also happens in politics a lot and sports. Okay. And so this theory goes this way. All right. People have decided this is how this person is. All right. This person has a certain mental state. Okay. Whatever this mental state is, it could be anything. All right. And so when something happens, they judge it based on the outcome. And they give that person more credit or more blame depending on whether the outcome is good or bad. Okay. So let's use sports, for instance. Let's use the refs again for this example. The officials are rigging this against my team. Okay, so we've assigned the cognitive idea that the officials are out to get me. The officials are out to get us, right? That's the cognitive, the judgment, the behavior that we've decided that the officials have against us. Or the NHL, for instance. That's the bigger idea. Is that the NHL has called down, or the NBA or the NFL, whatever, has called down to the officials and said, you have to, call more penalties or make more calls towards the team that we're playing against, right? Okay, so that's the cognitive process that's going on. So therefore, when the officials make a call that's good for your team, it's, they have to make it look good, right? They got to make it look good. They can't just overtly make it that way, make it obvious, right? Because then everyone's going to know, right? And then when the call goes against you, it's, see, I told you, they're clearly rigging it, right? So they get more blame for the bad stuff and they get less credit for the good stuff, right? Politics, completely this way, right? Biden right now, right? He eliminated student loan debt, right? So if you love Biden, it's, oh my God, he's the greatest guy in the world. He did wonderful things. He eliminated my student debt. He's the greatest guy in the world. But I just read a story yesterday that and I don't know if this is true, and I have no idea if this is true, because when you read things nowadays, like, you never know if it's true or not. But I read a story that he's allowing Ukraine to go and bomb inside Russia. Again, I don't know if it's true, but let's just assume that it is for the sake of this argument. Not a good look. But if you love Biden, what else is he going to do, right? Well, the opposite, right? If you hate him, right? Oh, look, he's doing these things, like bombing people and, and it eliminates student debt. Oh, he's eliminating debt and I had to pay my debt. Like, all right, more blame, not enough credit, right? Same with Trump. Opposite things, right? The guy's a convicted criminal. Been a criminal his whole life. No, it's a farce. It's this whole thing is rigged. It's a farce, right? And when he does something good, which he has, okay, like it's not all bad, right? And I know I'm gonna hear it from people, like, because the people that hate him, it's like he's never done anything bad. He's never done anything good. Okay, but like the Space Force thing, like, I agree with that. I like that. Okay, but it's like when he does something that's okay, like, no, it's still terrible. Space Force is stupid. It's a terrible name. It's like, he doesn't get any credit, right? And that's the model of wrongfulness: is you take into account the mental state of the person that you're blaming, and you don't give them credit, and you give them more blame, right? So that's that model. So people will say, well, look, I'm not like that. I'm going to be the thoughtful guy who takes into account things. And yeah, and they do take into account in this article the thoughtful people, the ones that take into evidence, right? the evidentiary outcome people, right? That blame changes with more information. The what they call the extra evidential outcome information, agent info, right? So the blame changes with more information. There are people like that, and I'm going to admit that they're more thoughtful people, right? So, like for instance, an example that is not related to the things that we're talking about here, like so if a person walks into a room and there's someone who they think is an intruder, they don't look, they just pull out a gun and shoot that person. Now, if you're going to blame that person for shooting that person, okay, maybe not, maybe you will. Will you blame them less or more if you find out that the guy shot the person and the person that they shot was a career criminal who's broken into multiple houses? Well, probably not, right? Will you blame them more, though, if you found out that the person that they shot without thinking, right? This is an impulsive shooting, is your daughter's boyfriend who just came in to the room to get something for your daughter, right? You can blame him a little more for not thinking through, right? Okay. Think about that, right? Car accident, right? If someone's speeding in a car and gets into a huge car accident, kills the other person in the car, are you going to blame that person more or less if you know that the person speeding in the car was trying to get away from the cops because they had drugs in the car, or was driving real fast because they had their family member in the car that just they were driving along and all of a sudden they had chest pain and they were having a heart attack and they needed to get to the hospital, right? When you find out the difference, right, you may blame them a little bit less. And that has to do with the evidence. And some people are like that. They will wait for the evidence. But in my experience, there's less of those people. But all right, I'm going to give you some of those people. All right, and then we're going to get into the social blaming, and this is where I think the social media aspect comes into it. Okay, and I'm going to put these up on the YouTube. These graphs, these X and Y plots, but the communicative structure of blame is what happens on social media. They have these acts, these social acts of moral criticism that they have grouped into these 4 different clusters, and they've broken them into 2 separate X and Y plots of graphs. And what you can see here on the graphs, and I'm going to try and describe them for the audio audience, is they have an X and Y plot of social acceptability versus similarity to blame. Social acceptability is on the Y plot. Similarity to blame is on the X plot. And then they have another graph of thoughtfulness on the Y plot, emotional intensity on the X plot. Okay. On the social acceptability Y plot, similarity to blame on the X plot. Blame, and they go from low to high, by the way. All right. Low is on the left end and on the bottom on the X and Y plot, and high is on the right end and the high end on the X and Y plot on both of the graphs. Okay. So on the similarity to blame and the social acceptability, blame is obviously on the high end on both of them. On the low end on both the social acceptability and the similarity to blame are things like attack and slander, right? Because those are less socially acceptable and not very similar to blame. It's not what blame is, okay? On the high end of social acceptability and on the low end of similarity to blame are things like object to and disapprove. And then there's a bunch of different things that are sort of in the middle. On the high end of emotional intensity and on the low end of thoughtfulness are also the same things like attack and lash out. And on the low end of emotional intensity, on the high end of thoughtfulness, are things like object to, find fault, and disapprove. Right? Blame on that scale is somewhere on the lower end of emotional intensity and sort of in the middle of thoughtfulness. Okay. And they have this concept called third person blaming. And third person blaming is the constructive feature of this is where the person, the agent that's being blamed is absent. And the blame addresses other observers in the offender's absence. And this is what social media is. Okay? It's the politician isn't there, the referee isn't there, the league isn't there. It's I'm just complaining to everyone around me about that person, and I want to be validated for my complaint. And this is social media. And what happens on social media is you get a lot of the things on the high end of emotional intensity, on the low end of thoughtfulness, and on the low end of similarity to blame, and on the low end of social acceptability, because what social media is mostly anonymous, almost always anonymous, and it's cathartic for people, and it lends itself to these kinds of behaviors. And the problem that they found with these low thoughtfulness, high emotional intensity behaviors is they are the worst type of behaviors to repair relationships for blame. They just don't work. And that's why you have these situations in social media where you just have people yapping at each other. Social media is the worst place in the world. The comment section, I said it, I think last time on the show, is the saddest place in the world. It's also the meanest place in the world. And it's the worst place for any kind of discourse. But this is what happens in social media is you get this third person blaming, you get it high emotional intensity. You don't get a lot of good discourse on social media. And you get a lot of blaming. And it's not even blaming, really. It's this attacking and lashing out, which is not even similar to it. Okay? And it's not similar to blame. It's just cathartic. I just want to complain about stuff. Okay? So why is it so emotional? Well, here's the thing. What happens with sports, as with politics, and it didn't used to be this way with politics, but I think it was always this way with sports, is the identity is associated with people. People have put themselves in the role of their teams, and they've put themselves in the role of their politicians and their party. Identity politics, I don't remember when it started. I think I've always sort of lived in a world of identity politics. I do remember someone mentioning once when I was younger that identity politics is a bad thing. And I think it's because of this. They foresaw this kind of thing. When you identify with something, it becomes your thing. It becomes you. So people identify with Trump, right? People identify with Biden. People identify with their sports team. When their sports team loses, or when someone says something bad about their politician, it's a personal attack against them. So when the referee calls a penalty on their player, it's them calling a penalty on them. And that's a personal attack. And so when someone personally attacks you, you don't just blame somebody, you attack back. That's a response to someone who feels personally attacked. Okay? That's the psychology of being attacked. It's this identity thing. What we need to do is we need to de-identify ourselves with certain things. Now, sports, there's no harm, I would say, in identifying with sports because sports don't matter really. It's fun, it's entertainment. It doesn't, we can talk crap about sports teams and stuff like that on Twitter and be talk trash. It's fine because ultimately we're talking about a trophy and there's always the next year, right? It doesn't really affect anyone. You're sad for a year, you get the next year, right? And there's always one winner. Okay? Politics is different. This could actually hurt people, and it does. And the way it's going, when you identify with this stuff, is it's going to lead to a war. And that's how it did 150 years ago, give or take, if I'm doing the math right. It's already leading to it now. I would say that we're probably in a cold civil war now. I think I've been saying that for about 10 years now, maybe 15. It will lead to a shooting war eventually. We need to de-identify ourselves with politics, but we're not, because our entire existence is identification with this, and it's being incentivized by the people making money off of it, especially the news organizations. I don't even want to call them that, the entertainment organizations that pass themselves off as news, and the politicians that are making money off of them. And that's the biggest issue with that. The second article that I wanted to just quickly mention, and it has to do with praise. There was 5 studies within this one study, but I just want to mention the first one. What they did in this study is they tried to find out how much blame or praise someone would give if they were to consider that person's mental state. So, in other words, the way the study was organized was they read a snippet, a vignette of an individual who sat down and read a newspaper that said, people in this city give a certain amount to charity, right? And then they gave less, the same, or more to charity, okay? And they also read another vignette where a person sat down and read a newspaper that said, people in this city, on average, right, cheat on their taxes by this amount. And then they also then cheated on their taxes by less, the same, or more. And then they were asked, how much blame would you give or how much praise would you give to the person that gave the charity, and how much blame would you give for the person that cheated on their taxes? And what do you think that person was thinking? Okay. And what they found was, not what they're thinking, but what do you think their desire was to do this act? And what they found was, that if you donated more, right? So if you donated less than the average or more, you got more praise for the more you donated. Okay. And if you cheated, right, cheated less, the same, or more, you got blamed commensurate with the amount that you did. Great. That all makes sense. But what happened was, is when you consider the desire that they thought you had to do that, right? The cheating was commensurate with the higher amounts that you cheated. In other words, right? If you cheated less, you got blamed for less, and the desire for that was commensurate with that, so you got blamed, and they thought you were going to cheat less, and you got blamed for less. If they thought you were going to cheat more, you got blamed for more. But when it came to the donations, the praise did not get higher for the desire to do it. In other words, yeah, you donated more than the average. We thought you wanted to, but we didn't give you credit for it. In other words, yeah, that's great that you donated more, but we're not going to give you any credit for that. Right? So, in other words, negative emotions, the cheating, gets more credit, in other words, for the positive stuff. And I think that that's a really bad place to be in as a society, is that the negative stuff gets more credit. But that's where we are. And why that is, I don't know. I don't know why that is. I think possibly it's because of who we are as people. And I'd like to get a social psychologist to prove me right, because I think it's because of who we are as people. That was my theory of people, is that we're just bad people, because people are just bad. That was my theory that I tried to argue a while back, when we had our podcast on evil, that I was disagreed with. But anyway, so that's the theory of blame. Mental health tip of the day is next.